This is Chronicles of the Old West. In our series Steel and Silk, The Life of Bat Masterson, we've followed Bat from Buffalo Ranges to the streets of Dodge, from train robbers in the snow to saloon gunfights under the lamplight. In Episode 6, the year is 1879. Dodge City is alive with legends and lies, its streets echoing with both laughter and gunfire. Bat finds himself drawn into railroad wars, standoffs with hard cases, and political battles as fierce as any fight with a six-shooter. Allies become rivals, rumors spread faster than the prairie wind, and for the first time, Bat must face defeat not in the streets, but at the ballot box. This is Episode 6 of Steel and Silk, The Life of Bat Masterson, The Fall of the Sheriff.
The year was 1878, and Dodge City had earned itself a reputation that stretched far beyond the Kansas plains. To some in the east, it was the Gomorrah of the plains, or the Babylon of the frontier. To others out west, it was simply the toughest little town in America. But Dodge wasn't remembered only for its saloon gunfights or its cattle trail violence. It was also remembered for its pranks, and no one loved a good joke more than Sheriff Bat Masterson. Bat had a streak of mischief in him, one that softened the hard edge of his lawman's reputation. Alongside men like Wyatt Earp, Luke Short, and Dave Mather, he could be as quick with a trick as he was with a six-shooter. Together, these men built Dodge's dual legacy, a town of deadly gunmen, yes, but also of pranksters who could humble a greenhorn with laughter as surely as they could with lead. Take the case of Eddie Foy, the vaudeville comedian. When he first strutted down Front Street with what locals called a Fifth Avenue swagger, he found himself suddenly roped, dragged, and mock-lynched beneath a tree. The noose was tightened, the crowd demanded his last words, and Foy, spotting Masterson at the edge of the mob, cool and ready to step in if things went too far, declared he'd rather give his speech at the bar of the Long Branch. The crowd erupted. The rope was cut, and the whole affair ended in laughter and drinks. That was Dodge, danger and comedy, mingling like whiskey and gunpowder. Such jokes made Dodge famous, but they also revealed something about Bat himself. He was a lawman who could shift from stern authority to sly humor in a heartbeat. To his friends, this dual nature was his charm. To his enemies, it made him unpredictable. But if Dodge was a stage for Bat's humor, the year 1879 would give him a new role. Commander, in a conflict not of cattle or cards, but of railroads and empire. The trouble began with silver, Leadville silver, hauled in endless wagons to Colorado Springs. Two great railroads wanted the fortune that flowed from the mines, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, and the Denver and Rio Grande. There was only one way into Leadville, through the Royal Gorge, a jagged canyon, where the Arkansas River cut through granite walls that rose 1,000 feet straight into the sky. The pass was so narrow that in places a man could stretch his arms and nearly touch both sides. Only one railroad could lay track there, and both meant to fight for it. What followed was called the Royal Gorge War, a conflict fought on two fronts. In the courts of Denver and Washington, lawyers dueled with writs and injunctions. On the ground, gunmen and hired posses squared off with rifles, pistols, and even cannon. And when the Santa Fe needed fighters, it sent a telegram to Dodge City. The message reached Sheriff Masterson in March 1879. Could he raise a posse, men to defend the company's work crews from Rio Grande attack? Bat didn't hesitate. He opened a recruiting office, and by dawn he had more than 30 men signed on. They boarded the train west, armed to the teeth, bound for Canyon City. Among them were some of the West's most notorious: Kinch Riley, Josh Webb, Ben Thompson, and the consumptive gambler doctor Doc Holliday. These weren't just hired hands. They were men who lived for danger, whose reputations were written in smoke and blood. For them, the Royal Gorge War was less about pay and more about sport. A Dodge City paper captured the mood. Towering like a giant among smaller men was one of Aaron's bravest sons. Jerry Converse, descended from a warlike clan, joined the ranks of war. We will bet a 10-cent note they clear the track of every obstruction. It wasn't just bravado. Dodge itself owed its existence to the Santa Fe. The townspeople saw the fight as loyalty repaid. At first, Bat kept the peace. The Rio Grande men had built stone forts deep inside the gorge, manned by 50 riflemen. Some of Bat's allies clamored to attack, but Bat refused. He was a lawman, he reminded them, not a mercenary. Bloodshed would solve nothing. They would hold their ground and wait for the Supreme Court's decision. That decision came in April. The court ruled the Rio Grande had prior right to build, but not an exclusive right. The matter, unresolved, dragged on. And when General Palmer of the Rio Grande renewed his push, the conflict flared again. By June, Bat had gathered 65 men and was stationed at Pueblo, the key junction of the Santa Fe's defense. The Rio Grande countered with its own force, backed by sheriffs wielding state writs of seizure. On June 11, 1879, battle seemed inevitable. At dawn, Palmer's men swept the line, seizing stations one after another. At Colorado Springs, Denver, and Cucara, fighting broke out. 2 Santa Fe men were killed, several wounded. By noon, every post had fallen, except Pueblo. There in the roundhouse, Bat Masterson and his Dodge City fighters held out. Armed with rifles and even a cannon, they defied the Rio Grande's demand to surrender. For hours, Pueblo trembled on the edge of war. Finally, Rio Grande Treasurer R.F. Whitebread met with Bat face to face. He argued the law was on their side. He urged Bat to spare lives, whether persuaded by reason or recognizing the futility of resistance. Bat agreed. He ordered his men to lay down their arms. The war was over, at least for him. Not everyone in Dodge approved. Some wanted blood, wanted their hometown gunmen to make a last stand worthy of legend. But Bat was not reckless. He had seen enough death on the frontier to know when courage became waste. Still, the fight left scars. One of Bat's men, Henry Jenkins, was killed, shot in the back by a Rio Grande guard. Another, Josh Webb, lost a tooth to a rifle butt. Even Bat himself was struck, smashing his revolver against a railway policeman's skull in the melee. And though peace eventually came, in 1880, the Santa Fe and Rio Grande agreed to divide Colorado, each taking its share of empire. The war marked a turning point for Bat. He had commanded men, faced down armies, and been forced to balance loyalty, law, and survival. For a man once remembered as a prankster sheriff of Dodge, the Royal Gorge had shown another side. Bat Masterson, the commander, caught between railroads and destinies. Yet for all the seriousness, Bat never lost his humor. Even as war clouds gathered, even as lives hung in the balance, he could quip, joke, or remind his friends that life was meant to be lived with a wink. That was the paradox of Bat Masterson. He was both lawman and jester, fighter and friend. In Dodge, he had been the sheriff who could take on any rough customer while keeping a sense of humor to go along with a joke. In Pueblo, he was the man who stared down a cannon standoff and chose restraint over ruin. 2 faces of the same man, 2 sides of the frontier itself. And as the decade turned, Bat's story was only beginning to change. Dodge City in 1879 was still a magnet for trouble. Herds of longhorns pushed up from Texas, filling the stockyards, and with them came the young trail hands, reckless, hungry for whiskey, eager for adventure. The saloons ran hot, the gambling halls rang with coin, and the lawmen of Dodge found themselves dancing between chaos and order nearly every night. Sheriff Bat Masterson, though technically Ford County's man, could never resist stepping in when Dodge's city officers found themselves in a scrape. He wasn't required to by law, but friendship, loyalty, and instinct tied him to men like Charlie Bassett and Wyatt Earp. One spring evening in May, that loyalty nearly cost him his life. 3 roughnecks from Missouri had tanked up in the saloons, determined to set Dodge City square on her ear. Assistant Marshal Wyatt Earp spotted them and clamped one by the ear, dragging him toward the calaboose. The other 2 slipped into a saloon, armed themselves, and waited in ambush at a dark corner of Front Street. Wyatt, still gripping his prisoner's ear, drew his pistol when he saw them closing in. But the man in his grasp clutched his gun arm, pinning it tight. For a moment, Earp was trapped, helpless with his revolver locked in his own prisoner's grip. Then Bat Masterson crossed the street. In an instant, he was beside Wyatt. With a swift motion, Bat brought the heavy barrel of his .45 crashing down on the prisoner's skull. The man crumpled to the ground. Bat swung his pistol toward one Missourian as Wyatt, freed at last, covered the other. 2 gunmen, 2 drawn Colts, and suddenly the fight was over. The Missourians dropped their weapons and submitted meekly. Earp marched them to jail, and the next morning they were fined and told to leave town. But Missouri pride runs deep. That evening, the 3 returned, vowing to kill Bat for meddling. They hid in a darkened store with pistols ready, sending a small black boy to lure the sheriff into the alley. The boy warned Bat instead. Rather than walk into the trap, Bat posted guards at the doors in front of the store. When the Missourians finally slunk out, they found themselves staring down Bat's revolver once again. Back to jail they went. They left Dodge the next day, this time with a lesson burned deep. Dodge City lawmen were not so easily taken. The Dodge City Times summed it up with dry humor. Dodge City is hard to take. The pistol brigands find it in a warm berth. For all the enemies he made among hard cases, Bat earned plenty of friends too, especially among the younger cowboys. At 25, he was not far removed from their world. He knew what it was like to ride into Dodge bug-eyed with excitement, to gamble away months of wages, to drink himself foolish in a saloon. He'd done it himself not long before. And unlike many sheriffs, Bat had a soft spot for youth. He was quick to laugh, quick to turn trouble into humor if he could. One story remembered by future lawman Jim Herron told the tale. A dozen cowboys were clogging the boardwalk, shouting and swearing, making it hard for women to pass. Bat climbed onto the roof above them where 2 barrels of water sat ready for fire. Handing Herron the hose, he grinned, "Hold this. I'm going to cool them woolies down." As Bat confronted the boys below, Herron opened the spigot. Stale water poured over the cowhands, soaking hats and shirts. The crowd broke into laughter, cowboys pretending to drink from their dripping brims. Instead of a gunfight, Dodge got a joke. That was Bat's way. He never took the job too seriously. And when real trouble came, he had the steel to stop it. But when he could turn a riot into laughter, he chose laughter. Not every cowboy left Dodge with fond memories. Many went home embarrassed by a night in jail and soothed their pride with stories of cruelty. Soon tales spread across the Texas ranges. Bat Masterson, the bloodthirsty killer, gunning down harmless cowboys at the drop of a hat. In truth, Bat's revolver spoke far less often than the legends claimed. But reputation has a way of running ahead of fact. Writers picked up the stories and embellished them. One painted Bat as having hands red with the blood of a score of men. Another called him the deadliest of Dodge City's killers. Worst of all was the tale of Clay Allison, the wolf of the Washita. Clay Allison was a man-killer, famed across the frontier for wild moods and reckless violence. In September 1878, he rode into Dodge with 25 cowboys at his back, looking for a fight. Some claimed he was enraged over the shooting of young George Hoy, a cowboy friend, wounded by Wyatt Earp. Others said Bat had insulted him by warning that Dodge had no room for Allison's kind of hell-raising. What happened next depends on who you believe. Cowboy detective Charlie Siringo swore that Allison prowled the streets, pistol in hand, hunting lawmen, but found none. Dodge, gripped by panic over a Cheyenne raid, had emptied its officers into the countryside. The town, said Siringo, was unofficered, and Allison swaggered unchallenged from saloon to saloon until a friend finally coaxed him to bed. Later writers told a different story. In one version, Bat crouched behind a curtain all day, with a buffalo gun trained on Allison's back, waiting to fire if he made a move. Another had Bat and Allison meeting face to face, greeting one another coolly, then parting without blood. Which version is true? Likely none in full. What we know is this. Bat was not even in Dodge during Allison's supposed rampage. He was in Kansas City, recovering from illness. The legend of the day Clay Allison made Bat Masterson hunt his hole is just that, a legend. But myths have a life of their own. And for years afterward, Texans swore Bat had been bested by the wolf of the Washita. If Dodge rang with false rumors, Bat's real challenges came soon enough. In late 1878, the Northern Cheyenne under Dull Knife broke out of their reservation and raided across western Kansas. Soldiers fought them south of Dodge, and the survivors, leaders like Wild Hog and Old Crow, were taken prisoner. In February 1879, Bat was ordered to escort 7 of the chiefs from Fort Leavenworth to Dodge City for trial in the civil courts. It was no easy assignment. Everywhere the train stopped, mobs surged forward to glimpse the shackled warriors. At Lawrence, the crowd pressed so close, Bat had to fight them back with his fists, striking the city marshal in the scuffle and getting himself arrested before the matter was smoothed over. In Topeka, 1,000 people swarmed the station. At every stop westward, curious onlookers jostled to see the dusky demons, as the papers called them. Bat held his line, muscling his way through, making sure his prisoners reached Dodge intact. For 4 months, the Cheyenne leaders sat in the Ford County Jail while their case dragged through the courts. In the end, the charges were dismissed for lack of evidence. The warriors were released, and Bat submitted his bill for their transport and care, a bill that ran into thousands of dollars. Critics scoffed that he was gouging the county for the innocent amusement of parading captured Indians. Bat insisted he had done his duty and deserved his pay. In the end, the commissioners awarded him part of his claim, but the dispute only deepened divisions in Dodge politics. By 1879, Bat Masterson's life was a study in contradictions. To some cowboys, he was a tyrant. To others, a friend. To Eastern writers, he was a killer. To those who rode with him, a steady hand. He could put down an ambush with a pistol barrel to the skull, or scatter a mob with nothing more than a bucket of water and a grin. And as Dodge City lurched toward the next decade, Bat would need every ounce of both. For the fights ahead would not be settled in saloon brawls or Indian raids, but in the grinding politics of the frontier, and in battles where his own friends and rivals would stand on opposite sides. The autumn of 1879 found Dodge City restless. The cattle herds were gone, the shipping season closed, but the town's gamblers and saloon men invented their own diversions. September brought what the Ford County Globe called a day of carnival. At first it was only buckets of water tossed from rooftops, but soon rotten eggs flew across Front Street, smashing into hats, coats, and shirt fronts. Men wrestled in the gutters, pistols flashed, and streams of blood streaked the sidewalks. Through it all, the finest work, said the Globe, was performed by none other than Wyatt Earp. It was a strange, half-comic, half-violent affair, proof that in Dodge, even a holiday had to be seasoned with blood and gunsmoke. But beneath the laughter and bruises, darker currents stirred. Dodge's political season was coming due, and for Sheriff Bat Masterson, the campaign ahead would mark a turning point in his life. One story, told years later by bartender George Hinkle, placed Bat at the center of Dodge's turbulence that September. Hinkle claimed that one night Bat barged into Hoover's saloon, looking for trouble, and was bodily thrown out by Hinkle himself. The next evening, Wyatt Earp supposedly came looking for revenge, only to find Hinkle waiting with a cocked pistol on the bar. Wyatt backed down, saying, "George, you win this time." The tale has the drama of a dime novel, but the dates don't hold up. Records show Wyatt had already resigned from the police force and left Dodge for Arizona days earlier. Still, the story reveals something important. By 1879, Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp were already larger than life. Myths clung to them like dust, whether true or not. Before Wyatt left for Tombstone, he urged Bat to follow, promising opportunity in the booming silver camp. Bat declined. He had work to finish in Dodge. He intended to run again for sheriff. Bat had reason to be confident. He'd spent 2 years chasing horse thieves, breaking up gangs and putting Dodge on the map as one of the toughest but most orderly towns in Kansas. Nick Klain's Dodge City Times called him the best sheriff in the state. But politics is a meaner game than any street fight. His rival was George Hinkle, the same bartender turned politician. Behind Hinkle stood the Ford County Globe and the Spearville News, papers eager to paint Bat as corrupt. Rumors spread like prairie fire. Bat was squandering county funds, gambling with taxpayer money, charging settlers for the return of their own horses. No evidence ever surfaced. When one farmer, Stevenson, was said to have paid Bat $25 for a stolen pony, he wrote angrily to the Times denying the slander. But the whispers kept coming. Friends urged Bat to ignore it. "Let the people see through the lies," they said. Bat listened, trusting their counsel. It was the worst mistake of his career. On Election Day, November 4th, 1879, George Hinkle swept every district. Bat lost by more than 100 votes. The defeat cut deep. He had staked his honor on his reputation, and the smear campaign had blackened both. Worse, he felt betrayed by his own allies, men like Klain and Mike Sutton, who had counseled silence. Years later, Bat would remember Kansas politics with bitter scorn, calling its practitioners the limit when it comes to sidestepping an issue. When he turned in his badge that January, he was only 26 years old, but already disillusioned. Defeat didn't cool Bat's temper. Bob Fry of the Spearville News mocked him as the Little Bull. Bat fired back in print with venom, calling Fry every name he could put to paper. The editor armed himself with a self-cocking pistol, knowing Bat's threats were never idle. Dan Frost of the Globe fared no better. Bat, acting as Deputy U.S. Marshal, arrested him on charges of receiving stolen government goods. Frost was indicted, but later released after businessmen petitioned for mercy. The charge smelled of payback, and everyone knew it. Bat was wounded not only in pride, but in trust. Dodge politics had turned on him, and many of his old allies melted away. Only a handful, like old-timer Bob Wright, continued to defend his name. "There is nothing low about him," Wright wrote. "He is high-toned and broad-minded, cool and brave." But the election had proved another truth. Many respectable settlers had grown weary of Dodge's sporting crowd, the gamblers, gunmen, and hardcases with whom Bat was often seen. It didn't matter that he disliked Doc Holliday or distrusted Bill Thompson. Appearances were enough. To the farmers of Ford County, Bat had grown too close to the very men he was sworn to police. When Bat handed his badge to George Hinkle in January 1880, he stepped away from law enforcement with little regret. The frontier itself was changing. The buffalo were gone, the Indian wars nearly over. Scouts and hunters were relics already, and lawmen were only as secure as the next election. But gambling, that was a vocation without politics, and Bat was good at it. He knew the cards, knew the odds, and above all, knew how to keep his nerve steady when the stakes ran high. So he drifted to Colorado. Leadville was in full boom, silver money pouring through its saloons. Faro tables ran night and day, bets climbing into the thousands. To men who lost their tempers when fortune soured, the presence of a cool-eyed gunman like Bat Masterson was insurance for the house. Offers came quickly, wages far beyond what ordinary dealers earned. Bat declined at first, unwilling to trade on his reputation. He played as a gambler, not a hired gun. Still, his very presence in Leadville's dens of chance lent them prestige. But Dodge was not yet done with him. One day, Ben Thompson, the fiery Texas gambler, came to him in distress. His brother Bill, known as Bully Bill, had been shot up in Ogallala, Nebraska, and now faced lynching. Bill Thompson was no stranger to trouble. Drunk and quarrelsome, he'd fired at a saloon keeper named Bill Tucker, shattering the man's hand. Tucker responded with a shotgun blast at Thompson's back. Now both men lay wounded, but Ogallala's citizens wanted Thompson strung up as soon as he could stand. Ben couldn't go. He was outlawed there. So he asked Bat. Ogallala was a speck of a cow town on the Union Pacific Line, 30 buildings clinging to the South Platte. Bat found Bill Thompson bedridden in the lone hotel, under guard by a young deputy who carried a long-barreled Colt with a white handle. Escape by wagon was impossible. They'd be overtaken. On horseback, Bill was too weak. That left the railroad. Bat waited for his chance. One Sunday night, the whole town gathered for a dance at the schoolhouse. Even the sheriff fiddling away at Turkey in the Straw was there. Only the deputy remained at the hotel. Bat enlisted the help of Jim Dunn, the bartender. Together, they brought drinks to the guard, whiskey sours laced with a touch of frontier chemistry. After the second glass, the deputy lay snoring on the floor. Bat hoisted the wounded Thompson over his shoulders, staggered to the depot, and carried him aboard the midnight train. As the whistle shrieked and the wheels turned, Dodge City's ex-sheriff and Texas's bad boy rattled eastward toward North Platte, free men. At North Platte, Bat carried Thompson straight into the saloon of Colonel William F. Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody, ever the showman, welcomed them royally. He hid them, outfitted them, and the next day loaned Bat his finest phaeton carriage and a strong team of horses. If Bat would wait, Cody said, they could travel partway together. A group of European dignitaries was coming west, eager for a taste of the frontiers. True to form, Buffalo Bill planned to guide them personally. So Bat, Bill Thompson, Cody, and the foreign party rolled south together, a merry caravan that stopped every few miles to liquor up. Even Cody himself, veteran of 1,000 binges, toppled half-drunk into Bat's wagon before the trip was through. At one point, Bat overturned the entire rig, splitting his lip and spilling Cody under a mountain of supplies. Neither man seemed to think much of it. By nightfall, they were feasting and laughing at a ranch house, Cody dazzling his guests with feats of horsemanship. The next morning, Bat and Thompson parted ways with the colonel. They rattled east into a storm, rain hammering down for 200 miles. When they finally rolled into Dodge, both men were soaked, battered, and bandaged, but they were alive. Thompson sent a telegram back to Ogallala. "Safe in Dodge. Come get me if you dare." The sheriff never replied. By the spring of 1880, Bat was no longer sheriff, no longer deputy marshal, no longer the frontier's rising young lawman. At 26, he was a gambler now, riding the rails between Dodge, Leadville, and Tombstone. Politics had betrayed him, but chance never had. And though he would wear the badge again before long, Bat Masterson had begun the next chapter of his restless, remarkable life.
Bat Masterson had risen fast. Buffalo hunter, gunman, sheriff. By the time 1879 closed, he had fought train robbers in the snow, stared down armed gunmen in the Royal Gorge, and laughed his way through the pranks of Dodge City's wildest days. But politics proved sharper than any six-shooter, and when the votes were counted, Bat's star dimmed. The sheriff of Ford County was sheriff no more. It was a hard lesson, one that left scars deeper than any bullet wound. Out here, power wasn't just won in the street, it could be taken in the ballot box. And for a man of Bat's pride, that defeat cut deeper than most. Here at Chronicles of the Old West, we don't just recount names and dates. We sift through the headlines, the court ledgers, and the dime novel myths to bring you the heartbeat of the frontier as it was lived. If this story gave you a new look at Bat Masterson, or at the West itself, consider leaving a rating, a review, or sharing it with someone who still believes the past should be felt, not forgotten. Bat Masterson's journey is far from over. Ahead lie new towns, new gunfights, and new reckonings, where his name will echo not just in Dodge, but across the West itself. Join us next time for the continuing saga of Steel and Silk, the life of Bat Masterson, only here on Chronicles of the Old West.